Hey everybody, welcome back to Sounds Like a Drum, Cadence Independent Media Production. Today, we are talking about the ruler tuning method 2.0, things we've learned, new things we need to look out for, and why this is still the method that we love to use. Now, if already you're wondering what we're talking about, we have a few videos in the past where we detailed a manner in which we use a ruler to measure the heights of the hoop on the snare side head so that we can get a really even tension and get a really beautiful response out of the snare wires. Today, we're going through that, but we are also going deeper into possible variables you could run into that might be specific to your snare drum that will require some adjustments along the way to make sure you get the best result. The first step before we do anything here is to identify and understand the nature of the snare beds that are on the drum that we're using. Everything we talk about today is going to be specifically applicable to 10-lug and 8-lug drums. 6-lug drums, some of the measurements might be a little bit different. We'll talk about that in the future, but since most of them are 10 or 8, we're going to stick with that. In order to identify the sort of snare bed that we have and how we need to interact with it, we need to understand the width of that snare bed, the depth of that snare bed, and how abruptly the ends of it occur along the edge of the shell. If you look at your drum as we have ours, with the bottom head off, upside down on a stand, first thing to look for is, can we find the ends of the snare bed? If the edges of your snare bed are visible and they exist between the two lugs that are adjacent to the wires, we're considering that to be a narrow snare bed. If the ends are visible in between the next two sets of lugs along the shell, that's moving into medium or possibly a very wide snare bed. Additionally, if there's a very clear, sudden start to the snare bed, a quick drop off from the rest of the bearing edge, we would consider that to be deep and also more of an abrupt one that we have to pay attention to when we start to adjust the head. Some drums, such as an acrolite or a superphonic, have both a very wide snare bed and also a relatively shallow one, to the point where unless you're really looking for it, you might not necessarily even see that it's there. This type of snare bed offers us the most options in terms of tensions that will work, types of snare wires that will work, and overall the largest variety of possibilities. The drum in front of me has a medium width snare bed that has fairly abrupt ends on it, and we wanted to use this one today because there are some specific things that occur with this type of setup that we have to pay attention to when we are tensioning and adjusting the snare side head after installation. If you're concerned that your drum differs from this one and that what we're doing here is not going to be applicable to you, rest assured that we're going to talk not just about how this one behaves, but how it differentiates from other drums with different sorts of snare beds and how to apply this to the drum that you have. The first step is we're going to lay the head on the drum and bring all of the tension rods on the hoop to finger tight. Now, for anyone out there who's curious about what finger tight even means, it literally just means how tight can I get these screws with my fingers and without utilizing a drum key. Normally, I will just spin them on the threads, go around a few times, make sure that I can't turn them any further, and then we call it finger tight. Now, the next step is that I need enough tension on the tension rods adjacent to where the wires are going to live to start to measure the heights of the hoops and make sure that I'm not pressing into the head or anything's deforming underneath it. So I'm going to give each of those 4 tension rods between 1.5 turns and 2 turns just to get the wrinkles out in that area and give me enough tension to measure. Now, a couple of things to note about this point in the process. Number one is that if at this point you're still seeing wrinkles, that's okay. We're not trying to get them all the way out. We just need a little bit of tension in there so that we can start to use the ruler. Additionally, if you're moving to the next tension rod and it's no longer in contact with the hoop, finger tight it again before you use the drum key because we don't want to count those turns as part of the tensioning. Now, depending on if you're using triple flange hoops or die cast hoops, your results will vary a little bit. Die cast are, of course, stiffer and heavier. They interact with the head a little bit different, but the process is still the same. Now that we have these 4 tension rods under tension, we need to check and make sure that the height of the hoop with the ruler is the same on all 4. I'm going to check all 4, see which one is lowest to the bearing edge, and then bring any others that don't match that down to meet it. Because of the nature of the snare beds on this drum, I actually don't want to measure these heights directly at these tension rods because I'm down in the snare bed, and we want to actually be getting this, again, with a deeper snare bed like this, measured outside of it. So we're going to go to the edge of the snare bed where the regular bearing edge begins and use that spot to give us a sense of how high the hoop is. The easiest way to do this is to set the drum vertically in your lap so that you can look directly at the side of the hoop, and then set the ruler on the other side away from you so that as you look across the hoop with the ruler set on the bearing edge on the head side, you can look at the measurement and see the height of the hoop move as you turn the tension rods. After measuring all 4 locations, we discovered that the hoop on this side is lower, and what this means is that we need to add tension to the tension rods on this side to balance it out and give us the same hoop height on both sides of the drum. Now that the heights of those 4 locations are the same, we're going to go around the drum in a star pattern, measuring the height of the hoop at each tension rod location and adding tension to that tension rod until we have the same height at all of the rest of the lugs. For this portion, it doesn't matter which lug you start with, but it does matter that you check and make sure that they are all still finger tight, because especially with the die-cast hoop that's a little stiffer, some of them may no longer be in contact with the hoop. Now that we've applied tension to all of the tension rods on this side of the drum, we're going to go back around with the ruler and check to make sure that they are all the same. If I find any spots along the hoop that are too high, I'll add a little bit more tension to the tension rod nearest to that location to balance it out. At this point in the tensioning, it's going to be very minimal, like small fractions of a turn, nothing too dramatic. We have even height of the hoop around the drum head, we have even tension, and at this point we can decide if we want to raise or lower the overall pitch simply by tuning this head, because now we know that everything is nice and even, and we can start from there and have a great benchmark for where we end up. Over the few years that we've been doing this show, we've run into and gotten to experience a lot of very different drums, specifically in terms of construction. And it's taught us a lot of things that we didn't necessarily know when we started out, because we had the drums we had, and those were the ones that we were used to. Over the course of changing a lot of heads and experimenting with a lot of tunings on a lot of different drums, some variables since the last time we talked about these tuning methods have shown up and given us a lot of insight into just how many possible adjustments there could be to this method based on the drum that you have. Things that we don't need to address in terms of this is shell material, drum size, bearing edge, style. These things do not affect the manner in which we are using a ruler to figure out how to get a good tuning out of the snare side head. The big elephant in the room is the size, nature, and behavior of the snare beds, and whether or not we need to be thinking about them specifically when we're measuring for the tuning of this head. In previous videos, we were using drums that we had, such as a Superphonic, and that's a perfect example of a drum that has a lot of options, very shallow, very minimal snare beds, and you can really just kind of measure to your heart's content anywhere on there and get a really good result. With a drum that has a more pronounced, narrower, deeper, or surprisingly different snare bed, you will have to start to experiment a little bit with that drum and keep your mind and your ears open to what is actually working, rather than sticking to an idea that possibly isn't going to work for that instrument. This drum is a perfect example of that. Again, this is a drum with medium width snare beds, but the start of them is very abrupt and they are fairly deep. And this again leads me to not measuring height inside of the snare beds, because it's going to lead us to adding way too much tension to those lugs, possibly damaging the hoop, possibly damaging the head, and definitely not giving us the optimal sound out of that instrument. Instead, moving that measuring location up onto the actual bearing edge of the drum and out of the snare bed is going to give us a better result all around, and again, keeps the hoop safe, keeps the head safe, and gives us the sound we're after. Any opportunity you have to spend some time with a new drum, doesn't even have to be one you own, just something different than what you're used to is going to expand these possibilities as well. If I had never run into a drum with really extreme snare beds, I wouldn't have the knowledge that I have now, despite how frustrating that was. So ultimately, getting yourself in front of as many different ones as possible, even just for a few minutes, and seeing what they'll do and what they won't do, is going to expand the possibilities with the drums that you actually use. Okay, now that we have the head installed and everything's tensioned evenly, we're going to install the wires and see what this thing sounds like. We've installed our wires, flipped the drum over. Sounds great. Pretty happy with where we landed. We didn't do any tuning adjustments after the tensioning up and the measuring with the ruler. And at this point, it's worth noting that you totally can. We now have an evenly tensioned snare side head. You can experiment with raising it up, lowering it down. We have plenty of videos detailing the relationship between batter tension, snare side tension, snare wire choice, and snare tension as well. And all of those things can factor into you getting the sound that you're actually after. And it's all easier if we have this nice level playing field to start with. Now, there are a lot of tuning approaches out there. There are devices, there are methodologies, there are whole websites dedicated to this stuff. The reason why we swear by this here is because it sticks to what is in front of you, the type of head you have, the type of drum you have, and all of the variables that are with that particular instrument on that particular day. Getting away from the idea that there's a right tension or number for the tuning or any other sort of angle that's supposed to get you a quick fix and get you a nifty snare drum sound without getting into why it even sounds like that. We love to cook around here too, like actual cooking in the kitchen, and this is another instance that is very similar, both metaphorically and actually, to understanding ingredients, understanding ratios, understanding what those ingredients are doing, because there's an end result that we're looking for. And in the case of tuning your instrument and going after a sound, there's a sound in our heads, or maybe on a recording that we want to emulate, that we're looking for. And if we have the ingredients, the constituent parts, and some ear training and knowledge about how this thing works, we can get there. And it expands the palette, keeps us excited, gives us inspiration, and allows us to continue to make the music that we want to make. All right, that about wraps it up. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the extra variables that can exist when you use this method to work on your snare side head. I've really enjoyed the way that these things have developed over time. We've had, again, a lot of drums through here, and we have learned a lot over the course of just figuring out how to get the snare side to do what we want it to do. If you want to hear more from us, please like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell so you hear about our new videos. And please, please, please make your way to the Patreon via the link below to see everything else we have to offer, including exclusive content, extra playing examples, produced examples, the cymbal series, and also if you just want to be a part of the community, it's a wonderful place to be. It's full of great drummers, great people, and we would love for you to join.